The modern seeker arrives at the gates of transformation burdened by a peculiar affliction, the weight of accumulated certainty. In an age of unprecedented access to information, the individual consciousness finds itself paradoxically impoverished, cluttered with inherited opinions, second-hand convictions, and unexamined ideological frameworks that masquerade as authentic understanding. This is the essential problem that the alchemical stage of putrefactio addresses, not as mere metaphor, but as an indispensable psychological operation demanding rigorous execution. The rotting of old ideas is not intellectual spring cleaning. It is the necessary death that precedes genuine rebirth. The concept of putrefactio emerges from the classical alchemical tradition as the second or third stage in the magnum opus, the great work of transformation. Found in the writings of Paracelsus, who understood chemistry as inseparable from spiritual regeneration, and systematized in the Hermetic texts that influenced generations of esoteric practitioners, this stage represents the blackening, the nigredo, the descent into decomposition that terrifies the unprepared aspirant. The medieval alchemists, working in their laboratories with actual substances, observed that before any base metal could approach the perfection of gold, it first had to be reduced to its prima materia, its original chaotic state. This was not destruction for its own sake, but dissolution in service of reconstruction. Carl Jung, excavating the psychological bedrock beneath alchemical symbolism, recognized in putrefactio the confrontation with psychic material that the ego has suppressed, denied, or simply failed to integrate. In his masterwork Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung describes this stage as the blackest of the black, where the practitioner must witness the decomposition of cherished self-concepts, the rotting away of protective personas, and the emergence of shadow material long buried beneath the veneer of civilization. Dennis William Hawke, in his comprehensive study The Emerald Tablet, emphasizes that this putrefaction occurs not merely in the realm of ideas, but in the very structure of identity itself. The Hermetic axiom "as above, so below" finds its most challenging application here. Just as physical matter must decompose to release its essential nature, so too must psychological structures break down to reveal the authentic self beneath accumulated conditioning. The premise is stark and non-negotiable. There can be no authentic transformation without the courage to allow cherished beliefs, comfortable identities, and familiar worldviews to rot into fertile soil. The true secret is not found in external initiation or exotic ritual, but in the willingness to undergo psychological death while remaining conscious throughout the ordeal. This is the philosopher's crucible, and the heat that transforms is nothing less than unflinching self-examination. To understand putrefactio requires grasping its position within the broader architecture of alchemical transformation. The Hermetic tradition, synthesized in texts like the Kybalion and expressed through the writings of Eliphas Levi and Manly Palmer Hall, presents a coherent system of principles governing both material and psychological transformation. At the foundation lie the three principles: Sulfur, the soul, consciousness, animation; Mercury, the spirit, volatility, transformation; and Salt, the body, fixity, manifestation. These principles are not substances but modes of being, energetic signatures that exist in all things, including human consciousness. Putrefactio operates specifically on the Mercury principle, the volatile, changeable aspect of psyche that contains both poison and medicine. Mercury is the trickster element, the agent of dissolution and recombination. When consciousness begins to putrefy, it is the mercurial aspect, thoughts, beliefs, mental constructs, that first enters decay. The sulfuric aspect, the animating will, the essential I am, observes this dissolution, while the salt principle, the physical embodiment, the behavioral patterns, resists it. This creates the essential tension of the work, consciousness watching its own contents decompose while the organism instinctively retreats from the discomfort. The connection to Kabbalistic doctrine illuminates this process further. In the Tree of Life, putrefactio corresponds to the descent from Tifereth, beauty, solar consciousness, the integrated ego, down through the harsh terrain of Gebura, severity, destruction, necessary limitation, toward the threshold of Daath, the abyss, the gap between ideal and real. The aspirant must willingly abandon the comfortable solar consciousness of achieved identity to descend into the sphere of Mars, where cherished illusions are destroyed by the severity of truth. This is not punishment but prerequisite. The false must be recognized and relinquished before the authentic can emerge. Neoplatonic philosophy, which deeply influenced both Hermetic and alchemical thought, describes this as the soul's necessary turning away from the multiplicity of appearances toward the one. Plotinus understood that consciousness becomes encrusted with false identifications through its engagement with material existence. These encrustation must be dissolved, putrefied, for the soul to remember its divine origin. The Rosicrucian tradition, as expounded by Robert Flood and later adepts, formalized this understanding into initiation rituals where the candidate symbolically dies, is buried in darkness, and awaits resurrection with transformed vision. The mentality required of the adept approaching this work cannot be that of the tourist seeking novel experiences or the intellectual collecting exotic concepts. The Putrefactio demands what Aleister Crowley termed true will, not the petty desires of the ego, but the fundamental orientation of the entire being toward its essential purpose. This will must be paired with what might be called the ethics of disillusionment, a commitment to truth even when truth destroys comfort. The aspirant must cultivate a specific disposition: radical honesty about one's actual psychological state, skepticism toward all inherited certainties, and willingness to sit with the anxiety of unknowing. This is why the Hermetic tradition emphasizes that the work is accessible to all but achieved by few. Most individuals lack the courage to watch their beliefs decompose, to acknowledge that their most cherished opinions might be nothing more than cultural conditioning or psychological defense mechanisms. The adept must develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one pole or the other. This requires simultaneously believing and doubting, knowing and questioning, holding form while allowing dissolution. It is a psychological posture, foreign to modern consciousness, which demands either certainty or nihilism, belief or skepticism, but rarely the productive tension between them. The journey through putrefactio is not a single event, but a gradual, often excruciating process with distinct psychological stages. Understanding these stages provides the aspirant with a map through territory that feels like madness to the uninitiated. The first movement, corresponding to the alchemical mortificatio, is the recognition of death within life, the acknowledgement that much of what we call living is actually automated response, deadened perception, and somnambulistic existence. This recognition often arrives unbidden through crisis, the collapse of a long-term relationship, the failure of a career that defined identity, the sudden awareness of mortality, or simply the slow accumulation of dissatisfaction with life's trajectory. Jung observed that such moments frequently occur in midlife, what he termed the metanoia, or fundamental turning of consciousness. But mortificatio as a conscious practice means not waiting for crisis, but deliberately examining the places where one is already psychologically dead, going through motions, repeating patterns, living according to scripts written by others. The aspirant begins to catalogue these deadened zones, the career pursued for parental approval rather than authentic calling, the relationships maintained through habit rather than genuine connection, the opinions defended because they are familiar rather than true, the pleasures that no longer bring pleasure but are nonetheless pursued. This inventory is brutal in its honesty. It requires admitting that perhaps decades of life have been spent in service of goals that were never genuinely chosen, in defense of beliefs that were simply inherited, in maintenance of an identity constructed more from fear than from freedom. As this recognition deepens, the second stage emerges, separatio. Here the alchemist separates the pure from the impure, the essential from the accumulated. Psychologically, this manifests as the painful work of distinguishing authentic impulse from conditioned response. What desires are genuinely mine and which are introjects? Psychological formations I've swallowed whole from parents, culture, peers. Which values reflect my actual experience of what creates meaning and which are simply unexamined moral reflexes? Jung's concept of the shadow, all that the ego has deemed unacceptable and repressed into the unconscious, becomes intensely relevant here. As separatio progresses, the aspirant encounters psychological material that has been kept from awareness precisely because it threatens the carefully constructed self-image. The ambitious professional discovers a long-denied yearning for simplicity and creativity. The self-identified rationalist confronts irrational passions and mystical intuitions. The person who has built an identity around kindness and agreeability meets their capacity for rage and selfishness. This encounter is not comfortable self-reflection, but visceral confrontation. Dreams become intense, often nightmarish, as the unconscious releases material no longer being successfully repressed. Relationships strain as the aspirant stops performing their assigned role in others' psychological dramas. Career and social identity feel increasingly hollow, like badly fitting costumes. There is a temptation here to retreat, to re-establish the comfortable defenses, to declare the journey complete after glimpsing a few shadows. The Hermetic tradition warns sternly against this retreat. Half measures in the work create not liberation, but neurosis. One becomes haunted by what was briefly seen, then denied again. The third movement brings what the alchemists termed putrefaktio proper, the actual decomposition of psychological structures that the previous stages have loosened and separated. If mortificatio is recognizing death, and separatio is distinguishing the living from the dead, putrefactio is allowing the dead to actually decompose rather than preserving it in formaldehyde. This is where the work becomes genuinely difficult, because it means actively withdrawing energy from beliefs, identities, and relationships that have provided meaning, even if that meaning was inauthentic. The aspirant experiences this as a kind of psychological nausea, a revulsion toward the very foundations of their previous worldview. Political convictions that once seemed self-evidently true now appear as tribal shibboleths. Spiritual or religious frameworks that provided comfort reveal themselves as sophisticated defense mechanisms against existential anxiety. Even the basic categories through which experience is organized, success and failure, good and bad, valuable and worthless, begin to liquefy into ambiguity. Jung termed this phase the dissolution of the persona, the social mask beginning to crack and fall away. But it goes deeper than social performance. It touches archetypal structures. The aspirant may find that fundamental orientations, I am the kind of person who, no longer hold. The psyche enters a genuinely liminal state, betwixt and between, neither the old self nor yet a new one. This liminality is characterized by several disturbing features: profound doubt about one's own judgment, difficulty making even simple decisions, a sense of fraudulence in professional or social roles, periods of intense anxiety or depression with no clear external cause, and perhaps most disturbingly, the erosion of the very sense of having a coherent self at all. During this decomposition, the psyche regresses to what Jung called the collective unconscious, layers of awareness more primitive than personal identity, where ancient archetypal patterns still pulse. Dreams become peopled with figures from myth and fairy tale, the wise old man, the dark mother, the trickster, the hero. These are not metaphors but autonomous complexes, psychoid structures that exist at the intersection of psyche and matter. Their emergence signals that the personal ego is dissolving back into the transpersonal matrix from which it originally differentiated. This is the massa confusa, the confused mass that alchemical texts describe with images of blackening, rotting, dismemberment, and death. The psychological correlate is a period where nothing makes sense, where previous certainties have dissolved, but new understanding has not yet crystallized. The temptation toward nihilism is intense. If all beliefs are merely psychological constructs, if identity is just conditioning, if meaning is arbitrary, why continue? Many spiritual crises and existential breakdowns arrest at this stage, unable to withstand the complete dissolution required for genuine transformation. Yet it is precisely in this state of maximum chaos that the alchemical miracle becomes possible. The putrefactio, when undergone consciously and completely, releases what the alchemists called the philosophical Mercury, the transformative essence that was trapped in rigid structures. Psychologically, this is the libido, the life energy, that was previously bound up in maintaining a false self. As that false self decomposes, the energy becomes available for new organization. But this reorganization cannot be willed or forced. It emerges spontaneously from the unconscious as a gift of grace. The alchemists were explicit. You cannot make the philosopher's stone. You can only create conditions where it forms itself. The final sub-stage of putrefactio is what the tradition calls the appearance of the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, a moment where the blackness of decomposition suddenly flashes with iridescent colors. Psychologically, this manifests as brief glimpses of a new mode of being, moments of profound presence, unexpected clarity, a sense of connection to something larger than the ego. These are not permanent states, but intimations of what is becoming possible. They provide hope during a process that otherwise feels like madness or death, evidence that the dissolution is not mere destruction, but preparation for synthesis. The period of deepest putrefactio precipitates what mystics across traditions have termed the dark night of the soul, an apt descriptor for psychological territory where all former sources of meaning, purpose, and identity have decomposed, yet the new self has not yet been born. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may resemble it phenomenologically. It is rather a teleological crisis, a necessary dying that serves the purpose of transformation, even as it feels like annihilation. St. John of the Cross, describing this stage in spiritual development, emphasized that the soul experiences the withdrawal of divine consolation, the absence of God, precisely when it is closest to union. The psychological parallel is striking. As the ego approaches dissolution into the self, it experiences this dissolution as abandonment, meaninglessness, death. The very structures through which meaning was previously perceived are decomposing. Naturally, life appears meaningless. The frameworks through which identity was maintained are rotting. Naturally, the sense of self dissolves. This crisis differs fundamentally from modern pathology, though modern psychology often confuses the two. Clinical depression typically results from repression, from psychic energy being blocked by neurotic conflict, from trauma unprocessed. The existential crisis of putrefactio is nearly opposite. It results from too much consciousness, from the breakdown of repressions, from seeing too clearly the arbitrariness of inherited meaning structures. The depressed person cannot feel. The person undergoing putrefactio feels too much and sees too clearly. Where clinical depression deadens and withdraws, the alchemical death intensifies and exposes. The aspirant becomes excruciatingly aware of their inauthenticity, their bad faith, their complicity in their own unfreedom. Every social interaction reveals itself as a calculated performance. Every opinion expressed sounds hollow. Every emotion feels both overwhelmingly intense and somehow false, as if one is performing emotions rather than genuinely experiencing them. This is what the existentialists termed nausea, the visceral recognition of contingency, of the groundlessness of all human meaning-making. The crisis intensifies as the aspirant realizes there is no external salvation. The psychological work cannot be outsourced to therapist, guru, or spiritual system. No amount of reading, no perfect technique, no magical ritual will do the work for you. This recognition can induce profound despair. I'm alone in this, utterly alone, and I may not be equal to what is required of me. The isolation is essential but agonizing. Friends and family, operating from their own unexamined frameworks, often cannot understand what is occurring and may pathologize it, insist on medical intervention, or simply withdraw in discomfort. Jung observed that his patients often experience this crisis as God dying within them, a phrase that captures both the gravity and the peculiar phenomenology of the experience. The psychic structures that had previously connected the ego to transpersonal meaning, whether religious faith, political ideology, scientific materialism, or humanistic values, reveal themselves as contingent, constructed, arbitrary. The aspirant sees through them, and in seeing through them loses their capacity to provide genuine orientation. What remains is naked consciousness confronting existence without interpretive framework, meaning-making capacity offline. existential vertigo-inducing psychological nausea. Yet, and this is crucial to understanding the difference between pathology and alchemical necessity, this crisis contains its own implicit telos. The suffering is not meaningless. It is the suffering of birth, of transformation, of breaking through to a more authentic mode of being. The alchemists understood this, which is why they described putrefactio not as failure, but as necessary stage. The soul must rot because it has accumulated layers of false belief, second-hand opinion, unconscious conditioning that prevent authentic existence. These layers cannot be gently removed. They must decompose from within, through the acid of ruthless self-examination and the heat of existential confrontation. This explains why attempting to bypass or medicate away this crisis often results in spiritual abortion, the process arrested midway, leaving the aspirant neither in their old identity nor successfully transformed. The medical model seeks to restore equilibrium, to eliminate suffering. The alchemical model recognizes that certain suffering is productive, that equilibrium must sometimes be destroyed to allow evolution. Not all psychological pain is pathology. Some is the labor pain of psychological birth. The adept enduring this stage must practice what might be called conscious suffering, remaining aware throughout the ordeal, neither dissociating nor collapsing, holding the tension without resolution. This requires extraordinary psychological fortitude and often benefits from having an experienced guide, a Jungian analyst, spiritual director, or Hermetic adept, who can confirm that what is occurring is not insanity, but initiation. The aspirant must learn to distinguish between the voice of authentic insight arising from the depths and the voice of neurotic fear attempting to reimpose old defenses. The alchemists promised that successful navigation of putrefactio yields the albedo, the whitening, the emergence of purified consciousness from the blackness of decomposition. Psychologically, this manifests not as a permanent high or blissful transcendence, but as a fundamentally altered relationship between ego and self, between conscious will and unconscious wisdom. The gold that emerges from this process is not perfect happiness but authentic being, the capacity to act from one's essential nature rather than from conditioning, to relate to reality as it is rather than as one has been taught to perceive it. The integrated individual who has completed putrefactio bears certain recognizable characteristics. First, a quality Jung termed psychological flexibility, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without rigid identification with any single viewpoint. Having watched their own beliefs decompose and reform, such individuals no longer mistake their current understanding for absolute truth. They hold convictions but lightly, willing to revise understanding when evidence demands it, capable of genuine dialogue across difference because they have witnessed the constructed nature of all frameworks. Second, an ethical gravitas emerges that is qualitatively different from conventional morality. Having confronted their own shadow material, their capacity for cruelty, deception, cowardice, the integrated individual is less judgmental of others while simultaneously holding themselves to rigorous standards. They understand that evil is not an external force, but a possibility within every psyche, and that authentic goodness requires constant vigilance and conscious choice rather than automatic adherence to inherited moral codes. Third, these individuals develop what might be called existential courage, the capacity to face uncertainty, suffering, and death without defensive retreat into comforting illusions. Having died psychologically during putrefactio, they have less fear of physical death. Having witnessed the dissolution of identity, they no longer cling so desperately to self-image. This produces a paradoxical combination of deep seriousness about life and profound lightness about self. They take their responsibilities seriously, but their ego lightly. The practical applications for modern existence are substantial. In a world characterized by rapid change, ideological polarization, and existential uncertainty, individuals who have undergone conscious putrefactio possess adaptive capacities others lack. They navigate career changes more fluidly because their identity is not rigidly tied to role. They weather relationship transitions more gracefully because they understand that all forms are impermanent. They engage political and cultural conflicts with nuance because they recognize the partial truth in multiple perspectives. Moreover, such individuals often feel a responsibility toward collective transformation. Having been through the death and rebirth process, they recognize others undergoing similar journeys and can serve as guides or witnesses. Jung termed this the wounded healer, one who has suffered their own psychological dismemberment and, through integrating that suffering, gains capacity to help others through similar terrain. The Hermetic tradition speaks of the adept's responsibility to the great work not only individually, but collectively, participating in the gradual transformation of human consciousness itself. Yet this must be undertaken with utmost caution against spiritual inflation. Having glimpsed deeper layers of psyche, having successfully navigated crisis that breaks others, the temptation arises to identify oneself as specially enlightened, to establish oneself as guru, to claim authority one has not earned. The truly integrated individual recognizes that their transformation, though real, is never complete. There are always deeper layers of shadow, subtler forms of self-deception, more refined illusions to decompose. The work is not finished until death, and perhaps not even then. The goal then is not to achieve some final state of perfection, but to establish a dynamic process of ongoing transformation, what the alchemists termed the circulatio, the continual cycling through dissolution and coagulation, death and rebirth in service of ever greater consciousness. This produces individuals who are simultaneously stable and flexible, rooted and adaptive, confident and humble. They have found their center, but know that center must be continually rediscovered as circumstances evolve. This is why the discipline and rigor emphasized by the Hermetic school is essential. The work cannot be approached casually as weekend workshop or self-help technique. It requires sustained commitment, intellectual rigor, psychological courage, and often years of patient practice. The Hermetic tradition has survived millennia precisely because it offers not quick fixes, but genuine transformation. And genuine transformation is always difficult, always costly, always requiring one to pay with the only currency the psyche values, the willingness to die to what one has been to become what one is capable of becoming. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that sustains the fire, and more in the courage to become the fuel itself, the willingness to burn away all that is not essential until only truth remains.